Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8, Civil Liberties. It's Lesson 3, about the Bill of Rights, and it's the first of a series of 3 lessons about the content of the Bill of Rights. In this lesson, you'll learn about the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the Third Amendment. Now, as we talk about the Bill of Rights, let's remember that the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments that were added to the United States Constitution in 1791. They were added as a group of amendments. That's why they collectively are known as the Bill of Rights, even though there's been other amendments since then. So there are 10 amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights, and in the previous lesson, we already talked about 2 of them. We talked about the 10th Amendment, which says that any powers not given to the national government are either retained by the states or by the people. And we talked about the 9th Amendment, which says, hey, just because we listed rights in the first 8 amendments doesn't mean that you don't have other rights also that were unenumerated, in other words, unlisted. As we talked about those amendments in the previous lesson, one of the things that was carefully pointed out was that the Bill of Rights includes those rights which the founders considered particularly important to check and control the power of the national government. In this lesson, we're going to look at the first 3 amendments that are found in the Bill of Rights, the first, second, and third. Now, we need some context for those amendments so we can understand how they fit together and what they're trying to accomplish. And we can be reminded of the context as we remember the purpose of the Bill of Rights. If you'll recall from what we've learned previously in this course, anti-federalists like Patrick Henry opposed the adoption of the United States Constitution. And one of the reasons they opposed it was because they thought it wouldn't do enough to defend our rights. And to alleviate those concerns, the Bill of Rights was added. But notice in this quote from Patrick Henry that he was also concerned that in addition to not defending our rights adequately, the new United States Constitution wouldn't allow us any way to defend ourselves against tyrants, people who might get a hold of the power of the national government and abuse it to oppress us as a people. Now, if you think about what tyrants do, what they have done throughout history, once they get power, then you'll begin to understand why the first 3 amendments were included in the Bill of Rights and what their purpose is. When a tyrant seizes power, perhaps one of the first things that they do is to prohibit anyone complaining about what they do. They silence their critics, so there'll only be one impression out there among the people that they're doing great. They also routinely confiscate weapons from anyone that might oppose them, so that the people lack the means to fight back. And then to make sure that the people stay in their place, they build up an army or a police force that directly answers to them, that can be used to control the people. Now, this has been true of tyrants throughout history, but we can look in modern history and see this particularly true. Adolf Hitler in Germany, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, Chairman Mao in China, Kim Il-sung in North Korea. These are all examples of dictators who came to power and followed these same basic procedures to maintain their power. So as we think about Patrick Henry's concern about tyrants, the concern of anti-federalists like him, and how the Bill of Rights was added to alleviate those concerns, we can see that in the first 3 amendments, the Bill of Rights is trying to ensure that we as a people have a way to fight back against tyrants, even tyrants within our own government, that might try to use the power of that government against we the people. So with that in mind, that the first 3 amendments are mechanisms for us to battle against tyrants, let's begin to look at what's actually included in these amendments, beginning with the first. The First Amendment is loaded with lots of stuff. We're actually going to look at 6 things that are included in it, 6 fundamental basic rights that we have that allow us to stand up against tyrants, among other things. The first of these we're going to look at is a clause in the First Amendment about not having an establishment of religion. Here's what the actual text of the Constitution says in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What this most basically means is that there'll be no Church of the United States. The United States government is not going to establish an official religion for the United States of America, which left open the opportunity for states at the time to have their own official religions, which all the states did. Now, eventually they got away from that, and that's not the way things are currently done by states in the United States of America. But at the time, the big worry was that the national government would try to impose a church on the rest of us, which would, in effect, dictate that everybody in the country have the same beliefs in this most profound area in their lives. And the national government was not going to be allowed to do that. The second thing found in the First Amendment is a clause about the free exercise of religion. Here's the text of it again in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof, referring to religion as was in the clause just before. So what does that mean? It means that people may believe what they wish and even act on those beliefs without the government interfering with them. So the people are going to have this other source of truth and right in their lives other than the government. They're going to be able to go to church where they want, not have an official church they have to go to, believe what they want. It's going to provide a competing center of power in their lives, even a way for them to get together and meet with other people to discuss their disappointment, their troubles, their concerns about the government, potentially even organize against the government. Because churches were a very important part of people's lives during this time period. They might be off on their farms, 10 miles away from everybody else the rest of the week, not really have a chance to talk to other people about their concerns about government. But on Sunday, almost everybody was together in a congregation somewhere, having an opportunity to interact with other people, talking about their fundamental ideas of what is morally right and morally wrong, and perhaps even realizing that the government doesn't fit in with that and having a chance to discuss their concerns with other people. The next thing protected in the First Amendment is freedom of speech. Here's the text. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Well, what does that mean? It means that people may speak what they wish, even if it is critical of the government of the United States of America. For example, in this picture here, they can essentially accuse the President of the United States of being a cold-blooded killer, and they can get away with it. Do you think you could do that in China under Chairman Mao or in Germany under Adolf Hitler? Of course not. But in the United States of America, you can be a critic of your own government. The next thing protected in the First Amendment is freedom of the press. The amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. What this means is that not only can you speak to other people complaining about the government, you can actually publish that idea in some way that a broader, bigger audience can hear you being critical of the government. Now, at the time of the founding, the way to do this was through print, through press, through publishing, written words printed on a page. In our modern society, it includes all kinds of things, from radio to television to Facebook. Any way that you have to spread your ideas among other people is what's being protected here. So that not only can you speak them, not only can you believe them, but you can spread them to others. Even ideas that are critical of the United States of America and its leaders. The next thing protected in the First Amendment is the right to peaceably assemble. The amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of people to peaceably to assemble. Okay, what does this mean? It means people can gather together with other like-minded folks to discuss, plan, and even massively protest against what the government of the United States is doing. There's no way that some tyrannical dictator, as long as we're enforcing the First Amendment, can come into power and shut up his critics. They're going to be able to gather together and discuss what they hate about this and even begin to organize opposition to whatever the government's doing badly. The final part of the First Amendment is the right to petition the government. The text says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This means that we can ask, even demand, that the government change things without repercussions. In other words, when we complain about the government, we can also specifically say, government, you need to fix this, you need to change that, and they cannot then come and punish us for requesting these changes. It allows us to freely then discuss what should be changed and ask the government to give them a chance to change before we may have to take more extreme measures. Which then leads us to the Second Amendment. The text of the Second Amendment. Now, keep in mind, this is following right up on the First. The First Amendment's giving an opportunity for people to think what they want, believe what they want, tell other people what they believe, organize together among those other people, and challenge the government directly. Now we find out what happens if that doesn't work. The Second Amendment says that we need militia in order to be free. And it says, for that reason, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, what does this mean? What it means is a free people has to have weapons to fight the government. It really means, this is what the thought was at the time of this being written, was that the generation that wrote this had just a few years before fought a revolution against a tyrannical government. They got their guns and went out and actually shot their own government because they thought they were doing so badly. And they wanted to preserve that right to the American people. The Second Amendment is really a right to stand up and shoot the government if necessary. Now, whoa, that sounds really radical and crazy. You've got to understand this is what they really meant at the time. It only seems radical and crazy to us today because we now have an over 200-year history of our government being reasonably good. We haven't really thought of a reason that we want to go and shoot them. Except maybe around the time of the Civil War, there were some people that wanted to. But through most of our history, we've thought our government's been tolerably good. And so the idea of organizing a revolution against it seems a little bit extreme to us. But there's another reason also, and that is that government now has weapons way beyond the guns that we may have in our homes. So the idea of the masses just getting their guns out and having a revolution seems a little far-fetched also. But that doesn't change what this amendment meant. At the time it was put in there so people could organize and become paramilitary squads called militia that would actually go out and fight against an oppressive tyrannical government and depose it. That's why we have the Second Amendment. So the First Amendment allows us to organize on an intellectual level against the government. The Second Amendment allows us to organize on a physical level against the government if the government becomes bad. Now let's move on to the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment's really odd from our modern point of view. It says that no soldier will be quartered in anybody's house. Well, what does that mean? What's it talking about? Well, at the time of the American Revolution, there was a practice where when a government would send soldiers somewhere to make it cheaper and easier for them to be there, they would just go up to people's houses and say, okay, we got 6 soldiers here now. They're going to be sleeping at your house, and you're going to feed us every day. It was a way to make it more cost-effective to employ an army. It was also a way to keep their eyes on the population to make sure that they weren't doing troublesome things. If you've got soldiers sitting in everybody's home, it's kind of hard for them to organize a rebellion. And it makes it a whole lot cheaper to have a big army when the common people are paying to feed and house them. So when you have the Third Amendment that prohibits that says that kind of thing can't be done, then it makes it harder for the government to keep an eye on people, to stop them from exercising their First and Second Amendment rights. It also makes it more expensive for the government to have an army, which makes it less likely that they're going to have an army. Now, why at the time of the founding did they really not want the government to have an army? Well, you can see in this quote from James Madison, it's because the government having an army just sitting around scared them. They thought that this would lead to tyranny. If you have an army around with nothing to do, and the government in charge of it, particularly an executive who's kind of like a king, it's going to be a big temptation for that commander-in-chief over the military to use that military force against his own people, to essentially take over and make himself a dictator. And so they thought a way to avoid that is not have an army just sitting around. And a way to avoid having an army just sitting around is make it more expensive to have an army just sitting around by, for example, not allowing quartering of soldiers in people's homes. Now again, this is something that's changed our country's history. Back at the time of the founding, where technology was so much more primitive, communication was so much more primitive, you could wait to raise an army when war was almost about to begin. We can't do that anymore. We can't wait to raise an army until after, if we go back to the way things were in the 1980s, the Soviet Union launches its nuclear strike against us. Okay, we already need to have an army sitting around long before that happens. So we've gotten used to the idea of having a standing army. But it doesn't change the fact that such things need to be feared enough that we keep watch on them. Because standing armies have certainly been used in other countries and will continue to be used in other countries as ways to overthrow the government legitimately chosen by the people. Every few years we see somewhere around the world where a military takes over a country. And this is the kind of thing the Founding Fathers were concerned about in the Third Amendment. All right, now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is not protected by the First Amendment? Is freedom of assembly not protected? Is the right to petition not protected? Is the right to be heard not protected? Or is free exercise of religion not protected? It's the right to be heard that's not protected. We can certainly complain to our government. Doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily listen. What is the purpose of the First Amendment? Is it to protect literature? Is it to allow diplomacy? Is it to stop harmful speech? Or is it to challenge the government? The essential underlying purpose of the First Amendment is to allow us to challenge our own government as a way to stop it from doing bad things. What is protected by the Second Amendment? Is it the freedom to assemble, the right to due process, the right to bear arms, or freedom from punishment? The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms so that we can be an armed populace potentially to stand up to a tyrannical government. What is prohibited by the Third Amendment? Is it quartering of soldiers, confiscating of guns, censoring newspapers, or establishing a state church? The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of soldiers in people's homes. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 8. It'll be Lesson 4. It'll be our second lesson about the content of the Bill of Rights.